I woke to the sound of a teacup settling into its saucer, as if the cottage remembered a hand it had forgotten. The old woman sat where the hearthlight shines, a small sovereign in paper-thin skin. I felt as if the house itself exhaled when she turned a page. She put down her book and held a cup between hands that had once closed on other people's reckoning. She tasted the air, and for a moment, the fog seemed to fold around her like a listening thing. When she spoke, her voice was small as bone and older than any sentence I had kept to myself. She said I was free to remember, and that her arrival had been a long work of mercy and of atonement. Mercy sounded like a stranger's name inside my ribs. I tested my mouth with it and found the syllables tasted like glass. She told the truth the way a diary admits what it cannot hide. She had been the judge who cut my years from me, the hand that tied my name to the lantern and the jars, the voice who taught me the chant that kept the fireflies patient. I listened, as if the words were rain on a roof I had built from my own undoing. She confessed that once, when grief had made her rigid with law, she cast me into duty rather than allow my grief to unmake the wood and stone of the forest. The confession arrived like an unlatched door in my chest. Things I had been missing folded back into place. A laugh like wind through a sleeve. A pair of warm hands that no longer existed. A night when I gathered a harvest of light with the thought to stitch flesh back from silence. I remembered taking them, the swarms I thought could stitch a man from memory. I had gripped jars until my palms ached, believed in their small rebellion, and stolen the forest's lantern for a love that would not return. She had watched and judged, and the punishment had been severe. My name was sanded from the ledger of who I had been, and in its place the forest kept a single instruction: wait for a successor. A sentence like an iron clasp. My anger rose like smoke. I saw again the long years of routine, the way my hands learned to move with a ghost of obligation, the loss that was repackaged into ritual. But as she spoke, another thing arrived beside the anger. A thin, strange thing I had not allowed myself to harbor. Forgiveness had already been lived inside the root chambers, she said, and the forest had softened toward me long before she returned. The forest had forgiven me, and I, who had tended its mercy as if it were a candle, had not realized the candle had once been relit. When she said she had come back because she could not bear my sorrow any longer, I watched the way her hands trembled as if apology had weight enough to break bones. She offered amends like a coin, heavy and warm. A wish, she called it. A single wish to undo the crookedness of my years, to let me step out of this service and into a single mortal life if I so desired. The thought of it made my heart stutter, a bird in a jar. To be mortal again meant every sting of loss would be sharper, but it also meant my grief could be carried without being folded into duty as ballast. I thought of his laugh dissolving in the morning fog, of the way he once set my hair free from its pins so the night wind could read between us. I thought of the hush I had traded for this steady, holy work. I will take the wish, I told her, and the words felt like stepping onto a bridge I had been told never existed. She warned me that granting such a thing would be costly, that she would risk a part of her existence to unravel the curse she had once tied so tightly, and that change would be dangerous and tender in equal measure. Danger and tenderness have been the twin companions of my life among the fireflies. I knew the scale of atonement this could demand, and still the memory of a man's hand in winter pulled like tide. She closed her book and read tea leaves as if the form of spill could make a contract. The steam rose and braided with the cottage smoke, and I watched that small ritual like watching a storm. The jars on my shelves trembled as if expecting to be emptied. The fireflies inside them pressed against glass with tiny, urgent hearts. I felt every pulse as a question. Mercy asked me to choose between two kinds of keeping: conserve the swarm and become an immortal custodian of borrowed stories, or release them and carry my love in immortal flesh again. Both choices would alter the map of who I had been. In a memory that toppled forward like a lost letter, I saw the face of the man I had tried to reclaim. He was gentle and stubborn, his collar always crooked from leaning too close to laugh, and his absence had become the contour of my skin. I thought of how the forest held its own suffering and still offered the light back tonight. I thought of the jars and their soft, persistent insistence that memory could be kept as if it were a coin to pay later. I opened my hand and let the wish out of my mouth like a breath I had been saving. I asked to be returned to one more life with him, to live mortal and tender with the man who had taught me the map of my own smile. She closed her eyes, and the cottage seemed to bow. The old woman's silhouette became thinner, as if she were threading herself through the eye of a long needle to make me whole. Forgiveness, she told me, should be embodied, not merely spoken. She said she could not live with the sight of my sorrow like a persistent storm, and so she would risk the part of herself that kept the forest from unraveling to set me free. I watched the night rearrange itself as if someone had moved a constellation with a gloved hand. The fog thinned, a corridor of roots seemed to make way, and the jars gave a last incandescent twinkle. Memory came back in a flood that toppled the neat piles of my life. Faces, small betrayals, the syllables of the old chant, the seam where I had tried to stitch a man from light. They returned like birds to a tree. I folded those returns into myself, feeling every wrong and every grace settle across my shoulders like a cloak. I forgave myself with a practicality that surprised me, and my anger softened into a new kind of ache. The old woman stood and placed her hand against the lantern I had tended for centuries. Sparks rose and braided like fireworks, and I felt the thinnest thing slide from my bones. The certainty that I must be forever. She gave me mortality as one gives a fragile seed. It was both a gift and a risk, and in the small space between one breath and the next, the forest hummed a slow, forgiving hymn. I left the cottage that night with hands that trembled but were my own. The jars were empty now of the light I had hoarded, but the world felt fuller with the memory of what I had loved. We are not made whole by keeping every light. We are made whole by tending what we can and offering back what must be free. Forgiveness that is acted upon is heavier and truer than any sentence. And mercy, worn like a living thing, will always reform the world in small, honest ways.